Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you settled and still. Tell me, is there a document before you this evening? Something signed, something trusted? We rarely question what is written down. Watson understood this well. That certainty accepted too quickly may blind even careful minds. The greatest deceptions wear the face of the obvious. Do subscribe, so no chapter escapes you. Now, draw the lamp a little closer, for as Holmes believed, truth conceals itself most cunningly behind what everyone has already agreed to see. Find us on Spotify, the link is in the description below. Chapter 1, The Gentleman from Sussex. There are evenings in Baker Street which fix themselves upon the memory with unusual permanence, not for any quality of violence or sensation, but for the particular stillness that precedes commotion. The glassy surface of a pond may betray no sign of what stirs beneath. The evening of the 14th of October was such a night. Rain had settled over London with the determined patience characteristic of autumn, and I had long since abandoned any intention of venturing out. My chair was drawn close to the fire, my manuscript lay open across my knee, and Holmes occupied the opposite corner of the room, in one of those postures of enforced idleness which he wore so poorly. He had not spoken for the better part of 2 hours. His long fingers drummed occasionally upon the armrest, and his grey eyes, when I happened to glance across at them, carried the faintly bruised expression of a mind denied its proper exercise. I had grown sufficiently accustomed to these silences not to intrude upon them. Holmes in repose was frequently Holmes at his most dangerous, in the sense that any disturbance would be met with a sharpness of manner not easily borne. I returned to my writing. Fire crackled with genial indifference. The rain measured its soft percussion against the window glass. It was therefore with a sensation somewhere between relief and apprehension that I heard footsteps upon the stair at a little before 8:30. They were deliberate footsteps, unhurried yet purposeful, and possessed of that particular heaviness which belongs not to the young, but to men past 50, who have carried considerable responsibility across many years. Holmes heard them too. I noticed the drumming of his fingers cease. Mrs. announced. Mr. Alistair Pembroke. He entered as a man enters who is unaccustomed to requiring assistance and finds the necessity unwelcome. He was perhaps 60 years of age, squarely built and expensively dressed. Though the quality of his coat was somewhat marred by the damp, his boots, despite evident care, bore the particular staining of a man who has come from heavier ground than London pavement. His face was that of a legal man, I decided immediately. There was in it a habitual precision, trained composure, which years of professional discipline had set as firmly as carving in stone. Yet composure, I observed, this evening, costing him rather more effort than usual. About the eyes, which were dark and deeply set, there lay the unmistakable shadow of a man who has slept badly for several consecutive nights. Holmes rose from his chair and gestured to the seat across the hearthrug, with the economical courtesy he reserved for visitors, who plainly had serious business. Mr. Alistair Pembroke, said Holmes before our guest had offered the information. Solicitor. Sussex practice, I should judge, from the nature of the clay upon your boots. You have travelled today, but did not come directly from your office. You came, I think, from a house of some considerable size, and one not in particularly good repair. Pembroke blinked. Something in his professional composure shifted fractionally, as though a precisely calibrated instrument had been nudged by an unexpected hand. You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said. It was not a question. I am. And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak with complete freedom. Pray sit down, Mr. Pembroke. You will have some brandy. No, I insist upon it. Had a and an uncomfortable several days preceding it. Brandy will serve you better than hesitation at this particular juncture. I poured, while Pembroke settled himself, resumed his chair with the particular forward inclination, which I recognised as the posture of genuine attention. Performance of boredom had vanished entirely. In its place was that concentrated alertness which made Holmes, at such moments, appear almost a different person from the languid figure I had observed not 3 minutes since. Pembroke arranged his thoughts with the deliberateness of a man accustomed to precision. I represent the legal interests of the Blackthorne family of Ravenshollow Manor in Sussex, he began. You may be familiar with the name. Sir Cedric Blackthorne was a figure of some standing in the county, though he lived somewhat retired in later life. He died a fortnight ago, at the age of 78. And the manner of his death? Holmes inquired with practised neutrality. Natural causes, or as near to natural as the physician could determine. Sir Cedric had been in failing health for some 2 years. His death was not unexpected. It is not the death, Mr. Holmes, but the circumstances immediately preceding it which bring me to your door. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. Continue. Pembroke set down his brandy glass and clasped his hands before him. In the final weeks of his life, Sir Cedric announced his intention to revise his will. The existing testament left Ravenshollow, and the bulk of the estate, to various charities and a distant cousin of little personal acquaintance. Sir Cedric wished instead to provide for his niece, Miss Evelyn Blackthorne, who had returned to England after a number of years spent abroad. The revision was to be formal and final. I had prepared the necessary documentation, a sealed packet containing the relevant genealogical proofs and inheritance documents, was placed in Sir Cedric's private study against the signing, which was arranged for the following morning. And the packet vanished, said Holmes. Pembroke looked at him steadily. It did. Sometime during the evening of the 9th, the packet was removed from the study. Without those documents, Miss Blackthorne's claim cannot be formally established to the satisfaction of the court. And the principal suspect? Holmes said. I noticed that his tone carried neither scepticism nor concurrence. He was, as it were, keeping his counsel. Arthur Vale, Sir Cedric's private secretary. He was discovered in the corridor, directly outside the study, at a time when he had no evident business there. He possesses a duplicate key to the room. He has, moreover, accumulated gambling debts of a nature which are widely known in the district, and he attempted to tender his resignation the following morning without explanation. Pembroke paused. The case against him appears, I confess, rather complete. Appears, said Holmes softly. The word seemed, as he spoke it, to carry a particular weight. Scotland Yard has been called in. Inspector Lestrade arrives in Sussex tomorrow. I had hoped, Mr. Holmes, that you might consent to accompany him, or perhaps precede him. The matter presents itself as straightforward, has details which I confess I cannot entirely account for. Such as Holmes said. Pembroke hesitated before replying, and in that hesitation I thought I detected something very close to puzzlement. He was, I sensed, a man whose professional instincts told him something was amiss, but whose reason could not identify precisely where. Vale himself, Mr. Holmes, he insists repeatedly to anyone who will listen that he is not the man they take him for. Pembroke's brow furrowed. He does not deny being in the corridor. He does not convincingly explain his attempted resignation, he returns again and again to that single phrase. Not, I did not take the packet. Not, I am innocent, only I am not the man they take me for. The room was briefly quiet, save for the rain. Holmes was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has heard something touch, very lightly, upon a string he has not yet identified. "Watson," said Holmes at last, without shifting his gaze, "does that particular choice of words strike you as in any way peculiar?" I considered it. "A man protesting his innocence generally denies the specific act," I said slowly. "Vale appears to be protesting something else. His identity, perhaps, or his nature." Holmes lowered his gaze and looked at me with an expression I had learned, across many years, to regard with a mixture of pleasure and mild unease. It was the expression of a tutor who has received, from a student of modest expectations, an answer rather better than was anticipated. "Quite so, Watson," he said. "Quite so." He turned back to Pembroke. "We shall be at Ravenshollow Manor tomorrow, Mr. Pembroke. I trust you will ensure that nothing in that study is disturbed between now and our arrival." After Pembroke had taken his leave, Holmes stood at the rain-streaked window for several minutes without speaking. When he finally turned, his expression was composed, but I knew from long familiarity that beneath that composure something was already moving. "Well, Holmes," I said, "straightforward case, would you say?" He reached for his pipe. "When a case appears straightforward, Watson, it is usually because someone has worked very hard to make it appear so." He said nothing further. But I noticed that, for the first time that evening, the restlessness had entirely left him. Chapter 2. Ravenshollow Manor. The train to Sussex departed Victoria at 7 minutes past 9, and spent the first portion of the journey in a silence I had learned not to mistake for inattention. He sat, with his hat pulled low, and his coat collar turned up against the chill that leaked through the carriage window, and he watched the dissolving outskirts of London give way to the grey and sodden countryside, with the expression of a man cataloguing rather than merely observing. I read the morning papers. The Channel weather was worsening. A foreign minister had made remarks of doubtful diplomacy. I did not trouble Holmes with any of it. It was only as the downs began to roll in earnest, and the light over the fields acquired the particular thin clarity of coastal proximity, that he spoke. "Tell me what you make of Pembroke," he said. Preamble. "A capable man," I replied. "Experienced, not easily alarmed. Whatever troubles him about this business is not mere professional anxiety." "Good. What else?" "He believes Vale is guilty. He believes the evidence against Vale is conclusive," Holmes said. "These are not always the same belief, Watson. Pembroke is too careful a lawyer to confuse them, which is precisely why he came to us." He said nothing further, and I was left to consider the distinction for the remainder of the journey. Ravenshollow Manor stood perhaps a mile from the village, approached by a long avenue of elms, whose aptera branches the autumn wind had already stripped to architecture. The house itself was a substantial pile of Jacobean stonework, added to without great coherence across 2 centuries, so that it presented to its visitors a facade of irregular windows and mismatched gables which gave the impression, not entirely dispelled upon closer acquaintance, of a building that had grown rather than been designed. It sat upon a rise above the coast, and the sound of the sea reached us as we descended from the trap. A low and persistent murmur beneath the wind, like a conversation conducted just beyond hearing. Pembroke met us at the door. Beside him stood a woman I took at once to be Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, whose severe dress and composed manner announced her function. Before Pembroke could perform the introduction, she was 60 or thereabouts, thin-faced and watchful, with the kind of domestic authority that accumulates over decades and becomes, in its later stages, nearly indistinguishable from proprietorial feeling. She regarded Holmes with the particular wariness that experienced household servants reserve for visitors who are likely to cause disruption. The inhabitants of Raven's Hollow were assembled, with varying degrees of willingness, in the drawing-room. Holmes paused on the threshold in a way I recognised, taking the room entire before committing himself to any part of it. Miss Evelyn Blackthorne sat nearest the window. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired and composed in her mourning dress, with a quality of stillness that might equally have denoted grief or self-possession, or something else altogether. She acknowledged our introduction with a slight inclination of the head, and said nothing beyond the minimum courtesy required. Colonel Marcus Davenant occupied the chair nearest the fire, as though by unquestioned right. He was a broad, weathered man of 60-odd, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his opinions attended to, and the slight impatience about his eyes of a man who considered the present difficulty a matter of insufficient military decisiveness. He shook Holmes's hand with vigour and immediately declared that the whole business was perfectly simple. Vale stood some apart from the others, near the bookcase, in the manner of a man who has accepted. For the time being, comfortable positions are not available to him. He was younger than I had anticipated, not above 35, with a pale, fine-featured face that carried the particular exhaustion of sustained anxiety. He met my glance directly but briefly. There was in his eyes something I found difficult to name at first. It was not guilt exactly. It was, I decided, the expression of a man who knows something he cannot yet make anyone believe. Reverend Julian Pike rose to greet us with the practised warmth of a man to whom social management has become second nature. He was slight and silver-haired, with long, careful hands, and the sort of deliberate cordiality that tends to precede deliberate reserve. He expressed satisfaction at Holmes's involvement with a smoothness I found, on reflection, rather too complete. Inspector Lestrade arrived from the village not 20 minutes after us. He entered with the good-humoured confidence of a man who regards the matter before him as largely settled, and the remaining procedures as formality. He shook my hand warmly, and Holmes's with a combination of professional respect and mild, competitive wariness that had characterized their association across a considerable number of years. "Nearly done, Mr. Holmes," he said, in a tone which was not quite triumphant, but was clearly not distant from it. "The case against Vale is solid as houses. Duplicate key, debts, opportunity, attempted flight. We shall have him before the magistrate. By Thursday, I don't doubt. I am sure you will find Thursday most instructive," Holmes replied pleasantly. Lestrade looked at him for a moment, decided the remark was agreeable, and proceeded to outline his evidence for the benefit of Pembroke, who had heard most of it already, watching Holmes. He had moved, during Lestrade's account, to the study doorway, and stood examining the lock with the quiet attention another man might give to a passage of interesting text. Then, without evident urgency, he crossed the room to the tall window, and looked out at the grounds below. Then he looked up. The window frame itself appeared to interest him. He touched the wood at the lower edge with one finger, and examined whatever had transferred to it with an expression of neutral attention. None of the room's other occupants appeared to notice any of this. Lestrade was still talking. Miss Blackthorne was looking at her hands. Colonel Davenant was nodding at intervals with an air of vindication. I found my attention drawn back to Vale. He was watching Holmes with an intensity I thought disproportionate to anything Holmes was visibly doing. It was the look of a man who has been shouting into a storm and has suddenly, unexpectedly, been heard. Holmes moved eventually to the corridor, where the grandfather clock stood against the panelled wall. It was a handsome instrument, tall and dark-cased, and it kept the present hour with the measured authority appropriate to its station. Holmes regarded it for an interval which seemed, given the clock's apparent lack of relevance, rather longer than the occasion demanded. He walked the corridor from clock to study door twice, measuring the distance in paces. Then he stopped and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. In the afternoon, Lestrade arranged for the household to be shown the evidence assembled thus far. Muddy prints on the passage floor boot-matched to Vale's own, burned remnant found in Vale's fireplace, fragments of seal wax visible at the scorched edge. The duplicate key recovered from his room. Lestrade set each item forward with the satisfaction of a man laying a sound hand on the table. Holmes examined the burned parchment last and longest. He held it to the window light without comment. He turned it once. He set it down. "The evidence is admirably coherent," he said finally. Lestrade beamed. "I thought you'd see it." "Coherence," said Holmes, "is not always a virtue in evidence, Lestrade. Muddy prints and burned papers and duplicate keys are the vocabulary of guilt. But vocabulary requires a speaker. The speaker is a question we have not yet adequately put." Lestrade's beam faded by degrees. He looked at Holmes as a man looks at weather he had not anticipated. That evening, before dinner, I found Holmes in the Manor Gallery, standing before a row of family portraits spanning what appeared to be several generations of Blackthorns. He stood before each in turn with his hands behind his back, his head at a slight angle, working along the wall in a manner that was methodical without being mechanical. "Interesting family," I ventured. "The family," said Holmes, without looking at me. "Rather more interesting, I suspect, than anyone has yet troubled to consider." He moved to the next portrait. A woman in Regency dress, dark-haired and composed, looked out from the canvas, with an expression of stillness I had seen somewhere that day already. I could not for a moment precisely determine where. Holmes stepped back, examined the picture from a greater distance, and said nothing further that evening. Chapter 3. Nature of Certainty. Holmes was already dressed when I came down the following morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he had arranged the previous evening's notes. Scraps of paper covered in his small, precise handwriting, into a pattern across the breakfast table that left almost no room for the toast rack. Mrs. Finch brought the tray herself, with the expression of a woman who had witnessed considerable eccentricity in this house over the years, but considered present variety a fresh imposition. Set the pot down with a restraint I found admirable. I cleared sufficient space for my cup, and studied Holmes across the table. He was eating with the abstracted efficiency of a man who regards breakfast as an interruption, his eyes moving between his papers, and some middle distance visible only to himself. "You slept," I observed. 4 hours. Sufficient." He pushed a slice of toast toward me, without looking up. "Pembroke has arranged for each member of the household to give us a full account of the evening before Sir Cedric's death. We begin after breakfast. I should like you to attend each interview, Watson, and I should like you to watch the witnesses rather than listen to them. You expect contradictions?" "I expect remarkable consistency," he said. "That is what concerns me." He would not elaborate, and I knew better than to press him. I ate my breakfast and turned the matter over in my mind as the coastal light strengthened at the window and the sound of the sea settled into its daytime register. The reconstruction began at 10 o'clock in the drawing room, which served, by Holmes's arrangement, as a kind of informal court. Pembroke was present throughout. Seated to one side with his notebook open, Lestrade attended the first two interviews with the manner of a man honouring a process he considers unnecessary. Mrs. Finch was the first to speak. She had composed herself for the occasion with the thoroughness of someone who approaches formal situations as a form of competition. Sir Cedric, she said, had taken dinner at 7:30, alone, as was his custom of late. He had retired to his study at 9:30. She had not seen him after that hour. The housemaid, Ellen, had taken tea to the study at 10:15 at Sir Cedric's ring. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Finch herself had gone to ask whether Sir Cedric required anything further, and had found the study empty and the corridor window, which gave onto the side garden, standing open. Holmes listened without interrupting. When Mrs. Finch had finished, he asked only one question. "How did you know the time of Ellen's errand?" Mrs. Finch indicated the corridor clock. She had heard it strike as Ellen went up the passage. Holmes thanked her. She departed with the composure of a woman who has answered satisfactorily and knows it. Ellen, the housemaid, was younger and less certain of herself in the room, though her account agreed in every particular with Mrs. Finch's. She had heard Sir Cedric's bell. She had brought the tray. The study door had been answered promptly. Sir Cedric had seemed, she said, quite himself. Perhaps a little tired, but no more than was usual. She could not say whether he had been alone. The door had been opened only sufficiently to admit the tray. Holmes asked her, "When the clock struck, were you already in the corridor, or did you hear it from the kitchen?" Ellen thought. "From the kitchen, just taking up the tray, when it struck." Holmes wrote something on the inside cover of his notebook. I could not read it from my angle. Colonel Davenant gave his account with the vigour of a military dispatch. He had dined with Sir Cedric, had spent the evening in the billiard room, and had retired at 10. He had not visited the study. He had seen Vale in the main corridor at approximately 5 minutes to 10, which he knew because he had consulted his pocket watch on his way upstairs. Vale had been coming from the direction of the study, he said, deliberate emphasis. Holmes asked him whether Vale had appeared hurried. Davenant considered this. Not hurried, exactly purposeful. And the packet. Had Sir Cedric mentioned it to you that evening? He had mentioned it over dinner, said the matter would be settled in the morning, and he was glad of it. Davenant paused. He seemed relieved. As though a weight was lifted, Holmes looked up from his notebook. "Relieved," he said. "Not anxious?" "Relieved," Davenant repeated with some firmness, remarked upon his spirits at the time. After Davenant, Reverend Pike settled into the witness chair with the ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. His account was measured and thorough. He had spent the evening in the library, reading. He had not heard the argument others had reported between Sir Cedric and Vale. The library, he reminded us, was at some remove from the study wing. He had been aware of Vale's financial difficulties, and had in fact, he added with pastoral gravity, counselled the young man to seek assistance. Vale had not taken his counsel. Holmes asked Pike to describe his acquaintance with Miss Blackthorne. The question appeared to surprise Pike, slightly. Not greatly, but enough to occasion a fractional pause before his reply. He had known the family for many years, he said. He had been gratified by Miss Blackthorne's return, and had assisted in his capacity as executor, reviewing the documents pertaining to her claim. The parish records. Among them? Holmes said pleasantly. Among them, yes. Old records, presumably, given the nature of the genealogical question. Inevitably, they were somewhat imperfect in places, as old records tend to be. Minor notations, clerical in nature, required clarification. Clarification, Holmes repeated in the same pleasant tone. Quite so. Pike's expression remained comfortable. But his long fingers, I noticed, settled on his knee with rather more pressure than the conversation seemed to require. Vale's interview was last, and it was the longest. He sat without the defensive rigidity I had anticipated, and something in his manner reminded me of a patient who has endured a protracted and misdiagnosed illness, and finds the diagnostic process itself almost a relief. After so long an uncertainty, he confirmed what was already known. He had entered the study briefly, at 10 o'clock, at Sir Cedric's own request. The old man had wished to discuss a matter concerning the estate papers, unrelated to the inheritance packet. Vale had not seen the packet on the desk, though he had not specifically looked for it. He had left at approximately 10 minutes past 10 and had gone directly to his room. He had not returned to the corridor. He could not account for the muddy prints, except to say that he had walked that passage many times, and that his boots were the boots of a man who worked in a country house. The argument, Holmes said. Witnesses heard raised voices. Vale met his eyes steadily. Sir Cedric was not angry with me. He was frightened. The room was quiet for a moment. Frightened of what? I asked. I don't know precisely, he said. Very little that was direct. He asked whether anyone had been examining the estate papers without his knowledge. He asked it twice. Vale's voice was level but effortful. He did not seem like a man concluding a piece of business, Mr. Holmes. He seemed like a man who had discovered something he had not expected, and did not yet know what to do about it. Holmes set down his pen. For a long moment he simply looked at Vale, with an expression that was not quite readable as sympathy, but was entirely free of scepticism. A phrase you have repeated, Holmes said at last. That you are not the man they take you for. What precisely do you intend by it? Vale was quiet for several seconds. I mean, he said carefully, that whoever arranged this wished me to appear to be a particular kind of man, a man desperate enough for money to steal from his employer, a man with the character for that specific betrayal. He paused. I am in debt, Mr. Holmes. I am not particularly proud of it, but I am not the man they have made of those debts. After the interviews, Holmes stood at the corridor window for some time, while Lestrade summarised the proceedings with an air of satisfaction, and Pembroke made careful entries in his notebook. The window looked out over the side garden. The latch, I noticed, was of the older spring variety, the kind that can be engaged from outside, with a thin instrument, if one is sufficiently familiar with its mechanism. Holmes turned from the window and addressed me quietly. The most dangerous theory, Watson, is the one that relieves the mind too quickly. He glanced toward the grandfather clock. Every person in this house agrees upon the times of that evening. Every single one, and every single one derives those times from the same source. He looked at the clock for a moment longer. Pran. We shall need to speak with the man who wound and cleaned it yesterday afternoon, he said. I find that I have one or two questions that only he can answer. Chapter 4. The Accepted Story. The man who tended the grandfather clock was named Briggs, and he had served Ravenshallow Manor in a general capacity for 11 years. Holmes found him in the stable yard shortly after noon, engaged in a task involving harness leather and linseed oil, conducted the interview there with a naturalness which I had long admired in him. The ability to treat any location as though it were purpose, built for the conversation at hand. Briggs was a compact, sun-weathered man of middle age, with the unhurried manner of someone who measures time by seasons rather than hours. He answered Holmes's questions without apparent anxiety, and without the rehearsed quality I had noticed in some of the household's previous accounts. Yes, he had cleaned and wound the clock on the afternoon of the 9th. He did so. Every fortnight, regular as the clock itself. He had found the mechanism running somewhat fast, as occasionally happened in cold weather, and had adjusted the regulator accordingly. The clock had stopped briefly, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps a little more. While he made the correction, he had restarted it and set the hands to match his own pocket watch. Holmes asked to see the watch. Briggs produced it without hesitation. It was a plain silver half-hunter of the working variety, its case worn smooth at the edges. Holmes examined the face, opened the back, studied the movement with the small lens he carried habitually. He returned it with a nod of thanks. "Your watch runs a little slow," he said. "Not greatly. Perhaps 15 to 18 minutes in a 24-hour period, I should judge. Have you had it regulated lately?" Briggs looked mildly surprised. "Not in some while, I suppose. It keeps well enough for my purposes." "I am certain it does," said Holmes. "Thank you, Briggs. You have been most helpful." As we crossed back toward the house, I turned the implication over carefully. Briggs's watch ran slow, and the corridor clock had been set to it, after being stopped and restarted. Then every time given by every member of the household was potentially wrong by a corresponding margin. Not wildly wrong, not impossibly wrong, just sufficiently wrong to shift a timeline in ways that might matter enormously. I said, as much to Holmes. He glanced at me sidelong. "I wondered when you would reach it. Then the window of opportunity is wider than it appears. For someone who knew the clock had been stopped and reset, yes. Someone who knew or could reasonably expect that every witness in the house would defer to it without question." He paused at the garden door. "Bear that in mind, Watson. Not who could have exploited the discrepancy. Who would have known to exploit it? Strad found us before luncheon with the expression of a man delivering welcome news. He had been occupied that morning with a search of Vale's quarters conducted under proper authorization, and the result had, in his assessment, settled what little remained unsettled. From beneath a loose board beneath Vale's wardrobe, he had recovered a railway timetable for services from Lewes to London Bridge, and beside it a leather travelling case already packed with shirts, collars, and the other necessities of a journey of several days. There was also a sealed envelope, addressed in Vale's hand to Pembroke's firm, which Lestrade had opened under the circumstances, and which contained a letter of resignation offering no explanation beyond a statement that Vale found it necessary to leave the district without delay. Lestrade set each item on the dining table as he described it, with the methodical satisfaction of a craftsman displaying finished work. "Preparation for flight," he said. "Packed bag, timetable, resignation letter. The interpretation is not complicated." Holmes regarded the items without touching them. "When is the letter dated?" Strad checked the 8th. "The evening of the 8th, Holmes said. The night before the theft." Lestrade paused for only a moment. A man in debt, with reasons to go, puts his affairs in order before committing the act. "It is not unusual." "No," said Holmes, "it is not unusual. It is, However, worth noting that a man who packs a bag and writes a resignation letter the night before a theft he has not yet committed either possesses remarkable confidence in his own future decisions, or is in flight from something that predates the theft entirely. He picked up the timetable and set it down again. I wonder what it was. Lestrade absorbed this with the patience of a man who has dealt with Holmes across many cases, and has learned that the most efficient response is occasionally no response at all. He gathered his evidence and confirmed that he intended to bring Vale before a magistrate. Within 2 days, took his leave. At luncheon, the atmosphere in the manor had acquired a settled quality, as though the house itself had accepted a conclusion. Colonel Davenant ate with restored appetite and spoke of other matters entirely. Mrs. Finch moved through her duties with the brisk efficiency of a woman whose household has been returned to comprehensible order. Reverend Pike was gracious and conversational, and inquired with warm concern after Miss Blackthorne had taken a light meal in her room and was not expected to dine publicly that day. Holmes was quiet throughout the meal and ate very little. He sat with the slightly unfocused expression I associate with interior calculation. Twice I observed his lips move fractionally without producing speech. Afterward, in the gallery, we found ourselves briefly alone. Holmes had returned to the portraits, and I joined him without remark. He stood before an earlier generation now, bearded patriarch in mid-Victorian dress, and beside him a younger man of similar colouring, whose painted expression combined faint arrogance with particular assurance of inherited expectation. Sir Cedric shouted at Vale. Holmes said, without preamble, "You have no rightful claim here." That is the phrase reported with the greatest consistency by every witness who heard it. Yes, the interpretation seems plain enough. Vale, in debt, pressing some financial claim on his employer. "The interpretation," said Holmes, "is the interpretation everyone arrived at before they considered any alternative. Tell me, Watson, is it not at least equally possible that Sir Cedric was not speaking of money at all?" I looked at him. "You think he was speaking to someone else?" "I think the phrase admits of meanings beyond the financial. A claim may be monetary, may equally be genealogical." He turned from the portrait. What if Vale was not being accused of something when those words were shouted? What if he had simply been present when someone else was? The question arranged itself uncomfortably in my mind. I looked back at the portrait. On the wall, the younger man beside the patriarch thought, and thought again of Miss Blackthorne's face at the drawing-room window, and of a similar quiver of stillness in painted features that had been hanging in this house for 150 years. I did not quite reach the conclusion Holmes had evidently reached already, but I felt its outline the way one feels the edge of a piece of furniture in a darkened room. "The parish records," I said slowly. Holmes turned to look at me. He said nothing, which was answer enough. That evening, after dinner, Reverend Pike gave a brief account of the estate's legal position to Pembroke, Colonel Davenant, in the library. Holmes sat in the corner of the room, with a book open across his knee, apparently engaged in reading. I knew better. His eyes moved from the page to Pike with the regularity of a pendulum, and each time they settled on Pike, they remained there a fraction longer than casual interest would warrant. Pike spoke of the inheritance with the fluency of a man who has mastered a brief. Evelyn's documents were in order. The genealogical proofs, while now missing from the stolen packet, could be substantially reconstructed from parish records and from the testimony of those who had examined them. He himself had reviewed records. He himself could attest to their content. Holmes closed his book without marking the page. "You are very certain of the records, Reverend," he said pleasantly. "I have read them carefully," Pike replied in a tone of similar pleasantness. "Parish record is only as reliable as the hand that made the entry," Holmes said. "I have found, in the course of various investigations, that old records reward close scrutiny. One sometimes finds amendments, corrections, entries that were added to clarify, or perhaps to simplify, what was originally rather more complicated." He paused. "I intend to visit the church tomorrow morning. Find I have developed a considerable interest in the Blackthorn lineage." Pike smiled. "You will find everything in order." "I am quite sure. I'm sure I shall find everything as it was left to be found," Holmes said. "Good evening, Reverend." Walking back along the corridor toward the guest rooms, I asked Holmes directly what he expected to discover at the church. "I expect," he said, "to discover what someone hoped I would not notice, rendered in ink so old that no one thought to look at it twice." He paused at his door. "Persistent certainty in this house, Watson. Is that Evelyn Blackthorn is who she says she is? I have been asking myself since yesterday evening why a certainty so universally shared has required so much invisible labour to maintain. Bidge B." He went in and closed the door, and I stood for a moment in the corridor with that question settling around me like the cold air coming in from the coast. Chapter 5: Voices and Expectations. The village church of St. Bartholomew stood at the lower edge of the settlement, separated from the last cottages by a churchyard of considerable age, and a lich gate whose timber had weathered to the colour of old bone. Holmes walked through it at 9:15 the following morning with the particular energy he reserved for occasions when he was moving toward something rather than waiting for it to arrive. I followed, turning my collar against the salt wind that came in off the downs. The vicar, red-faced and agreeable man named Alderton, who had held the living for 12 years, received us with the hospitality appropriate to an unexpected visit from persons of evident respectability. Holmes explained the easy vagueness he could deploy when required, that he was conducting certain inquiries on behalf of the Blackthorn estate, and wished to examine the older parish registers. Alderton had no objection. The records were kept in the vestry, he said, in a condition he described as reasonable, by which he appeared to mean that they existed and could be located. The vestry smelled of candle wax, cold stone, and the particular quality of age that accumulates in rooms used regularly but never warmed. The registers were arranged on a shelf, in dated order, their spines labelled in a variety of hands spanning nearly 2 centuries. Holmes went directly to the volumes covering the 1840s and 50s, drew them down without ceremony, spread them across the vestry table with the systematic attention of a man who knows what he is looking for and is largely certain where it will be. I examined the register nearest to hand, while Holmes worked along the relevant entries with his lens. The pages were dense with baptismal records, marriages and burials, the handwriting shifting gradually from the copperplate formality of earlier decades toward the more compressed style of later ones. Nothing appeared remarkable to my eye. I said so. Holmes did not reply immediately. He had stopped at a page roughly 2/3 through the second volume, and was studying it with a stillness that I had learned to read the cessation of searching and the beginning of finding. He examined the entry for a period of perhaps 2 minutes before leaning back and addressing me, without looking up. Come and look at this, Watson, at what surrounds it. I came around the table and bent over the page. Psst. The entry he indicated was a baptismal record for a child named Margaret Constance Blackthorne, dated the 14th of April, 1853. Post. The handwriting was consistent with the surrounding entries. The ink appeared uniform. At first glance there was nothing whatever to remark upon. Then I looked more carefully at the margins of the page. The paper there was very slightly, almost imperceptibly, smoother than elsewhere, a faint difference in surface texture, consistent with having been dampened and dried at some period after the original recording, beside the entry. In what appeared at first to be a marginal notation of the kind Alderton had described as clerical amendment, 3 words added in a hand that matched the primary entry so closely as to be nearly indistinguishable. Nearly. The amendment adds a second surviving child, Holmes said. A daughter, Eleanor, recorded as a twin to Margaret. The addition is accomplished with considerable skill. The ink has been aged artificially. I can demonstrate the method if required. The evidence is plain enough to the trained eye. The paper has been locally treated to reduce the contrast between original and amendment. He straightened. Whoever did this is not a forger of the ordinary sort. This required patience, knowledge, and access to the register over a period of time. Eleanor, I said. And from Eleanor, a line of descent leading to Evelyn. Genealogical bridge constructed in old ink, Holmes said. Solid enough to satisfy a solicitor, a court, and an entire household, provided no one examined the physical substrate of the record, rather than merely reading it. He closed the register carefully and replaced it on the shelf. We said nothing of this to Alderton, who saw us out with the same agreeable warmth with which he had received us. Entirely unaware, I thought, of what his vestry contained, Holmes was quiet on the walk back to the manor, and I was occupied with the particular sensation of watching a picture rearrange itself around a fixed point. The investigation had admitted of one interpretation for so long that shifting it required a deliberate effort, like turning a ship in shallow water. The servants Holmes interviewed that afternoon were the 2 who had not yet given formal accounts. Young footmen named Peters and the kitchen maid, a shy girl of perhaps 19 named Agnes, who looked as though the process caused her physical discomfort. Peters had little to add. He had been occupied in the dining room throughout the relevant evening and had seen nothing of consequence. Agnes, however, hesitated. Before answering Holmes's first question, in a way that I had learned to distinguish from ordinary nervousness, was the hesitation not of a person who does not know what to say, but of one weighing the consequences of saying it, waited without filling the silence, which was frequently more productive than any question. "I did hear them," she said finally, "in the passage outside the study. I was bringing the coal up, and I stopped because the voice was not what I expected." "Whose voice?" Holmes said quietly. "The old master's, sir. He was very loud. But it didn't sound angry, not properly angry, not like I've heard a person angry before. It sounded—" She paused, searching for the word with visible effort. "Frightened. Like a person is when they're frightened, and trying not to show it by speaking very loud. Did you hear what was said?" "Only some of it, sir. Most of it I couldn't make out, but he said very clearly, 'You have no rightful claim here.' And then there was a lower voice answering, woman's voice, and I couldn't make out the words of it at all." The room was briefly still. Holmes's expression did not alter. "A woman's voice," he said. "Yes, sir." Agnes looked at her hands. "I didn't say it before, because Mrs. Finch had already told the inspector. It was Mr. Vale who'd been in the study, and I thought maybe I'd got confused. But I know what I heard. After Agnes had gone, I sat across from Holmes in the small room. Pembroke had set aside for our use and considered what we had accumulated. Vale had been in the study at 10, or approximately 10, by his own account. But he had left. Someone else had been in the passage after that, someone whose voice Sir Cedric had not raised to in anger, but in fear, and who had answered in low, controlled tones. Clock. Stopped and reset to a slow watch. Had shifted every agreed timeline in the house by somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, ensuring that whoever moved in that window moved unseen by the assumptions of every witness. She has been very composed, I said. Throughout. Composure is an attribute, Holmes replied. It tells us something about the person and something about what the person needs others to believe. He turned a pencil end over end between his fingers. Person in this house believes exactly what they expect to believe before the matter began. Davenant expected a dishonest secretary. Mrs. Finch expected trouble from a man in debt. Lestrade expected a case with a straightforward suspect. The household's expectations assembled the case against Vale as efficiently as any conspirator could have wished. And Pike? I said. He knew about the records. Pike's expectations are rather more deliberate, Holmes said. Tossed. There is a difference between a man who sees what he wishes is to see and a man who has arranged the view. He set the pencil down. Shall go to London tomorrow morning, he said. There are handwriting experts I wish to consult, certain legal archives, whose contents are not accessible from a Sussex vestry. I expect to be away no more than 1 day. He looked at me directly. While I am gone, Watson, I should like you to watch Miss Blackthorne. Not obtrusively. Simply observe how she conducts herself when there is no one in the room whose opinion she particularly requires. I said I... Holmes added, though it were an afterthought. She is an intelligent woman. Intelligent enough to know that the evidence is nearly complete, and that nearly as a distance some people find worth attempting to close. He paused at the door. If she approaches Vale, for any reason, under any pretext, I should like to know of it immediately. He left the next morning on the early train, and I found myself alone. At Ravenshollow, with the particular responsibility of a man posted at a door whose threshold he has been told, not precisely why, to watch. The manor continued its recovered rhythms around me, and Miss Evelyn Blackthorne moved through it with the grace and self-possession of a woman entirely at home, which was, beginning to understand, precisely the performance it was. Chapter 6. The Missing Assumption. Holmes's absence produced, absences sometimes do, a curious amplification of everything he had left behind. The manor felt neither quieter nor louder without him, somehow more legible, as though the presence of his attention had been itself a kind of lens, and the things he had looked at retained, in the hours after his departure, a temporary luminosity that I was not entirely sure I was competent to read. Post. I spent the morning of his first day away in the manner he had suggested. To say I moved through the public rooms of Ravenshollow with no particular agenda and watched. It is a mode of observation. Watson the physician is perhaps better equipped for, than Watson the friend of Sherlock Holmes is generally credited with being. A doctor learns early that what a patient does while waiting tells a considerable story about what the patient believes, and what the patient fears, and the inhabitants of Ravenshollow, relieved of Holmes's immediate scrutiny, were in a manner of speaking all waiting. Colonel Davenant wrote letters at the library desk, and smoked his pipe on the terrace with the uncomplicated vigour of a man whose position in events clear to him. Mrs. Finch managed her household with restored precision. Peter's polished silverness kept to the kitchen and did not meet my eye when I passed through. Vale remained in his room by what appeared to be a combination of personal inclination and Lestrade's quiet insistence. Tss, tss, tss. I saw him once through the open door of his room, sitting at the small writing table with papers before him, not writing, but looking at them, with the inward expression of a man who is composing arguments. He does not yet know how to deliver, and Miss Evelyn Blackthorne did something I had not observed her do since our arrival. She walked, not the measured progress between rooms that I had watched her make since Holmes and I came to Ravens Hollow, but a genuine solitary walk, taken without announced intention in the middle of the morning, out through the garden door and down the slope toward the cliff path that ran above, coast. I followed at a distance that I hoped was sufficient, feeling rather more like a man engaged in an undignified errand than a useful assistant to a celebrated detective. She walked for perhaps 20 minutes along the cliff path, dark coat moving against the grey-green of the downs, her pace unhurried but continuous. She did not stop to look at the sea, which struck me as notable in a woman supposedly returned after years abroad, and presumably glad of the English coast. Paused. She did not look at the grounds. She looked, as far as I could determine, at a middle distance in front of her feet, the concentrated inwardness of someone rehearsing a problem that has not yet resolved. Point where the path curved around a shallow outcrop of chalk. She stopped. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she turned, retraced her steps to the garden door, and went back inside without having spoken to anyone or done anything that a careful observer could have classified as significant. And yet I found, walking back myself through the salt air, that I was convinced I had watched a woman calculating, not enjoying, not grieving. Calculating. I reported this to Pembroke over luncheon, in terms sufficiently general not to commit either of us to an interpretation. Pembroke listened with the attentiveness of a man who has been revising his own professional conclusions in private, and is not displeased to find that revision has company. "She has been," he said carefully, "very correct throughout. In all her dealings with me, with the estate, the legal questions. Exact, prepared, always ready with the relevant document or the precise date." He folded his napkin. "I have practiced law for 31 years, Dr. Watson. In my experience, clients who are genuinely and simply in the right tend to be rather less exactly prepared than those who have organised their position in advance. And you said nothing of this to Holmes?" "I said nothing of it to anyone," Pembroke replied, "because I had no evidence. Only a professional sensation that I had elected to attribute to excessive caution." He paused. "I am attributing it to rather less caution this afternoon. It was midway through that same afternoon that Colonel Davenant sought me out in the sitting room with an expression that mixed discomfort with resolve. The expression of a military man approaching ground he considers inadvisable, but necessary. He sat down, declined the offer of anything to drink, and came to his point with the directness I had come to associate with him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what Holmes asked me at the reconstruction. Whether Sir Cedric seemed relieved over dinner. I said he did, and I stand by it. But I did not say everything I might have said, because at the time I considered it irrelevant." He settled his broad hands on his knees. Sir Cedric also said, over that dinner, that he had long feared someone might contest Evelyn's claim, steal it, contest it. The distinction seemed small to me then. And now, I said, now it seems to me that a man who fears his claim will be contested is a man who has some reason to believe the claim is contestable. Davenant's jaw tightened. I was fond of the old man. I did not pursue the thought at the time, because I did not wish to. Now, I am telling you now because I find I cannot entirely justify the reason I did not tell Holmes when he asked. After Davenant had gone, I sat for a time with his words arranging themselves alongside everything else. Sir Cedric had feared someone would contest Evelyn's claim. He had been relieved on the evening of his death. Relieved. I now understood, because the matter was settled, but because he believed he had taken steps to settle it. The inheritance packet had been assembled, the signing was arranged for the morning. And that night, something had occurred in his study that had frightened him. I thought of Agnes's voice in the corridor, a woman's voice, low and controlled. I thought of the forged entry in the parish register, surface-treated, its ink aged, its execution requiring patience and repeated access. I thought of Reverend Pike's long, careful hands and his smooth account of harmless clerical amendments. Holmes had asked me, before his departure, why everyone assumed the stolen claim had benefited Miss Blackthorne. I had not fully understood the question at the time, beginning to understand it now. The packet had been removed. Without it, the revised will could not be formally executed, and without the revised will, what remained? The original testament, the charities, the distant cousin. Not Evelyn. The theft had been designed to benefit Evelyn. It had failed. Unless the theft had not been designed to benefit Evelyn at all, rather to prevent something else. To prevent, perhaps, the signing of a document that would have triggered the legal scrutiny that a formal inheritance always invites. The scrutiny under which a forged genealogical record, however skillfully made, might not indefinitely survive. Packet had not been stolen to secure the inheritance. It had been stolen to forestall the process by which the inheritance would be examined. I was still sitting with that thought when Lestrade appeared in the doorway with a constable at his shoulder and announced, in the tone of a man who has not quite lost his certainty, but is working harder to maintain it than yesterday. A fragment of legal correspondence had been found concealed in Vale's quarters during a second search, bore the crest of a London firm, and contained references, in oblique language, to the inheritance packet. Found in his quarters, I repeated. The wainscoting, Lestrade said. Wrapped in oilcloth, I looked at him. And who conducted this second search, Lestrade? Were Vale's quarters unattended at any point this morning? Lestrade's certainty diminished by a perceptible degree. The constable was at the door, he said, somewhat less firmly. At the door, I said, not inside the room. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has picked up a tool he was confident he understood, and found it unexpectedly awkward in the hand. He said nothing further, but I noticed that he did not add the new evidence to his formal notes that afternoon with quite the satisfaction he had brought to previous editions. I wrote to Holmes that evening with a full account of everything I had observed. I sealed the letter and gave it to Pembroke's clerk to post on the early collection. Then I went to bed, lay awake listening to the sea, rearranging the shingle at the foot of the cliffs, thought about a woman walking a cliff path, without once looking at the view, about what it means when someone has gone to very great trouble to make certain that a question is never properly asked. Chapter 7. The Strengthening Illusion. Holmes returned on the afternoon train of the following day, I met him at the station in the trap Pembroke had placed at our disposal, and I knew before he had descended to the platform that the London visit had given him what he sought: hard. There was about him the particular quality of contained energy that I associated not with excitement. Holmes was rarely excited in the common sense, the word, but with the satisfaction of a man whose theory has survived contact with evidence. He said almost nothing on the drive back to the manor. He asked how Vale was bearing up and whether Lestrade had moved toward formal charges. When I told him about the fragment of legal correspondence found behind Vale's wainscotings, he was quiet for a moment. Behind the wainscoting, he said, wrapped in oilcloth. How very thorough, he said, and looked out at the passing downs with an expression that was not quite a smile, but close enough to one to be distinguishable from its absence. Back at Ravenshollow, Lestrade was waiting in the hall, with the restless authority of a man who has made a decision and is impatient to execute it. He informed us, prepared a full formal report for the magistrate. The evidence against Vale was, in his assessment, conclusive. He intended to proceed, to arrest that same evening, and would appreciate Holmes's agreement that the investigation was satisfactorily resolved. Holmes listened to all of this with the patience of a man hearing a long preamble to a question he has already answered. "I should like one further day," he said. As if impatience condensed to something approaching frustration. "On what grounds, Mr. Holmes? Packed bag, the letter, the timetable, the correspondence behind the wainscot. The evidence is not merely sufficient, it is abundant. What can one further day conceivably add?" "I find," Holmes said mildly, "that abundance of evidence occasionally rewards a second look, particularly when it accumulates so conveniently." He removed his coat and handed it to Peters, who had appeared in the doorway. "One day, Lestrade. To that I shall not obstruct you." Lestrade agreed with the manner of a man making a concession he considers unnecessary, but has calculated as cheaper than a prolonged argument. He retreated to the sitting-room, and I followed Holmes upstairs, where he set his travelling case on the bed and extracted from it a flat leather folder, which he held for a moment before opening it on the writing table. Inside were 3 documents. 2 were photographic reproductions of handwritten material, the originals of which I did not immediately recognize. The 3rd was a letter on the headed paper of a firm of London solicitors I did not know, addressed to Holmes in reply to inquiries he had evidently sent ahead. He spread them on the table and stood back. "The handwriting experts," I said, "among others." He tapped the nearest reproduction. "This is a sample of Reverend Julian Pike's handwriting, obtained from the vestry correspondence file at St. Bartholomew's, which Alderton was kind enough to allow me to photograph this morning on my way through the village." He tapped the second. "This is an enlargement of the marginal amendment in the baptismal register, the amendment that introduced Eleanor Blackthorne to the historical record." I looked at both. Correspondence sample showed Pike's hand. Clearly, a deliberate, careful script with characteristic ligatures in the connecting strokes between certain letters. The amendment in the register, reproduced at sufficient size for comparison, shared those ligatures with an exactness that no amount of artificial aging could disguise. The A, connected to its following letter in precisely the manner Pike's hand connected it. The descending loop of the Y was identical in proportion and angle. "A handwriting expert could establish this in court," I said. 2 independent experts reached the same conclusion without knowledge of one another's findings," Holmes said. Pike made the amendment. "Not recently?" and not hastily, but the hand is his beyond any reasonable contest. He folded the reproductions and moved to the third document, the solicitor's letter, which he read again briefly before turning to me. The legal archives were rather more instructive still. The Blackthorn estate has been subject to various legal proceedings over the decades, as old estates tend to be. Disputes over boundaries, tenancy agreements, a contested bequest in the 1870s. In the records of that bequest, filed with the court at the time, there is a complete genealogical account of the Blackthorn family, prepared by the family's own solicitors. Margaret Constance Blackthorn is recorded as an only child. There is no Eleanor. There is no twin. The record predates any possible amendment by more than 30 years and was prepared by parties entirely independent of Reverend Pike or anyone connected to the present matter. I sat down. The weight of it was not dramatic in the way of sensational revelation. It was rather weight of complete certainty, which is a different thing, and in some respects heavier. Evelyn has no claim, I said. Evelyn has a constructed claim, Holmes said. Constructed with skill, with patience, and with the assistance of a man who had access to the parish records over many years, and whose position of trust ensured that no one thought to look too carefully at what he was doing with them. He closed the folder. Now, he said, tell me everything that occurred while I was in London. A complete account, beginning with Evelyn's cliff walk and ending with Lestrade's newly planted evidence. Listened, without interrupting, his elbows on the writing table and his fingers pressed together at their tips, when I described Davenant's confession about Sir Cedric's exact words at dinner, that the old man had feared someone might contest Evelyn's claims, nodded once. Briefly as a man nods when a piece he had anticipated falls into its anticipated place. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Sir Cedric knew, I said. He had discovered the fraud. He suspected it, Holmes said. Distinction matters. He suspected it sufficiently to gather the genealogical documents, to arrange for the revised will, to write to Evelyn requesting an explanation. That was the conversation in the study. Not Vale and Sir Cedric. Sir Cedric and Evelyn. He paused. The old man summoned her. She came. He confronted her with what he had found, and the words every witness interpreted as directed at Vale were directed at her. You have no rightful claim here. And she took the packet to prevent him signing the will and triggering proper scrutiny. She had no choice from her perspective. Formal will referencing her inheritance would have required a formal legal examination of her genealogical proofs. The amendment in the register would not have survived it. The packet was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to everything she and Pike had constructed. Holmes pushed back from the table and stood. She removed it. She left through the side corridor window, which she left open, either from haste or to suggest an outside intruder. The clock, stopped and reset to Briggs's slow watch, had given her a margin of nearly 20 minutes that no witness could account for without knowing the timepiece had been altered. She used it. And Vale? Vale's misfortune was geographical. He was in that corridor at the right moment and possessed the wrong combination of attributes. Debts, a duplicate key, and a desire to leave a situation that had already made him uneasy for reasons he had not yet been able to articulate. He was, as it were, ready-made. Holmes moved to the window. Outside, the light was failing over the downs. She did not construct the case against Vale from nothing. She found what was already there and ensured that everyone looked at it in the right order. I thought of the hidden correspondence, wrapped in oilcloth, placed behind the wainscoting of a room whose occupant could not prove he had not put it there. The fragment Lestrade found, I said. That was placed yesterday. While the constable was at the door and not in the room, Holmes said. Yes, we stood in silence for a moment. Below, somewhere in the manor, a dinner gong sounded. The measured domestic sound of it seemed, in the context of everything we had just said, almost bewildering in its ordinariness. Tomorrow, Holmes said, I shall ask that the household be gathered. All of them, including Lestrade. He turned from the window. I have been, in the estimation of everyone in this house, the one obstacle between Vale and a Thursday magistrate. I intend to demonstrate that the obstacle is rather more substantial than they have supposed. He said it without theatricality, as a man states a practical intention. But I knew the tone well enough to recognise what lay beneath its surface. It was the tone of a man who has held his hand for several days and is preparing with considerable deliberateness to show it down. I went down to dinner with the odd, alert sensation of a person who knows that tomorrow will settle something, and is not entirely certain they are prepared for what settled means. Chapter 8. Holmes alone against the world. The gathering was arranged. In the drawing was arranged for 10 o'clock. Asked Pembroke to ensure that all members of the household were present without explaining why. Pembroke, who had by this point developed a quality of watchful patience I found admirable in a man of his professional temperament, made the arrangements without asking questions. Lestrade was informed that Holmes wished to make a brief statement before the investigation proceeded to its formal conclusion. Lestrade, interpreting this as capitulation, arrived 2 minutes early, with the good humour of a man who has won a wager he was always confident of winning. The room settled into its arrangements, naturally, each person finding the position that suited their understanding of events. Davenant stood near the mantelpiece. Mrs. Finch took a chair against the wall with the composure of a woman attending a formal proceeding. Peters hovered uncertainly near the door, until Pembroke gestured him further into the room. Vale sat in a straight-backed chair somewhat apart from the others, his hands on his knees, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been braced against a verdict for so long that the muscles of his will have begun to ache. Reverend Pike chose a chair near the window, crossed one knee over the other, and folded his hands in his lap with an ease I now found, knowing what I knew, rather remarkable. He looked precisely as he had always looked, measured, calm, a man at peace with his position in the room. Miss Evelyn Blackthorne sat between Pike and Davenant, her morning dress pressed, her back straight, her hands quiet in her lap. She had, since Holmes's return from London, undergone a slight but perceptible change. But it had acquired an effortful quality, the way a held breath is quieter than a natural one, and yet somehow more audible for what it contains. I doubted anyone else in the room noticed it. Holmes had not looked at her yet. He stood at the centre of the room with his hands behind his back and addressed the assembled company in a tone of such conversational reasonableness that several faces in the room wore expressions of mild puzzlement, though they had arrived expecting a performance and been offered a lecture. "I want to speak this morning about assumptions," he began, "not evidence. Evidence we have in considerable abundance, as Inspector Lestrade has correctly noted. I wish instead to examine the assumption upon which every piece of that evidence was built, because it is my contention that every conclusion reached into this investigation rests upon one proposition that was accepted so early and so unanimously that no one thought to put it to the test. Lestrade shifted in his chair. He had the expression of a man hearing the first bars of a piece he had not arranged. Proposition, Holmes continued, is this, that Miss Evelyn Blackthorne is who she represents herself to be. That she is, in fact, Sir Cedric's niece. That her genealogical claim to the Blackthorne succession is legitimate. He paused. Once that proposition was accepted, and it was accepted before my colleague and I arrived in Sussex, before Inspector Lestrade arrived, before anyone thought to examine it with the interest it deserves. Everything that followed arranged itself accordingly. Theft was interpreted as an attack upon Miss Blackthorne's inheritance. Mr. Vale, who possessed debts and keys, and unfortunate proximity, identified as the attacker. The evidence accumulated. The case closed around him like a room whose doors are shut one by one until no windows remain. He turned for the first time toward Evelyn Blackthorne. She met his gaze with the control of a person who has prepared for this moment, and intends not to be the first to look away. Miss Blackthorne, Holmes said, in a tone of perfect courtesy, you spent several years abroad before your return to England. Would you describe for the room the school you attended in Geneva between the ages of 12 and 16? The name, the district, any particular quality you remember of it. The room was completely still. Evelyn's reply was smooth and immediate. She named a school, gave a district, described a view from the upper dormitory windows with the fluent specificity of a prepared answer. It was a creditable performance. Holmes listened to all of it without expression. Thank you, he said. And the family you stayed with in Malta during the year prior to your return, the Marchettis. Your documentation indicates you would remember the arrangement of their house? The language spoken at table? Fractional hesitation. Not long. Not long enough, I suspected, for anyone without particular reason to look for it to detect. They spoke Italian, she said, and French on formal occasions. Italian and French, Holmes repeated. He nodded. You are very well prepared. Psst. He said it without inflection, which made it considerably more arresting than if he had said it with any. Hosts. Into his coat. He reached into his coat and produced the leather folder he had shown me the previous evening. He opened it on the writing table beside him and set the two photographic reproductions side by side. I have here a sample of Reverend Pike's handwriting taken from the correspondence files at St. Bartholomew's, and an enlarged reproduction of a marginal amendment in the parish baptismal register for the year 1853. The amendment records the birth of a twin daughter named Eleanor, from whom, through two subsequent generations, Miss Blackthorne's claim of relation to Sir Cedric is derived. He looked at Pike. Two independent handwriting experts, consulted separately in London, and without knowledge of one another's findings, confirmed that the amendment and the correspondence were written by the same hand. Pike's composure did not shatter. I had half expected it to, and it did not. He looked at the reproductions with the steady attention of a man evaluating a difficult text, and his expression became, by very careful degrees, that of a man who has decided that the moment has arrived for a different kind of composure than the kind he has been wearing. But he did not speak. Furthermore, Holmes said, the legal archives in London contain a genealogical record of the Blackthorne family, prepared by independent solicitors in the 1870s, and filed with the court, which records Margaret Constance Blackthorne as an only child, twin. No Eleanor, no line of descent connecting any living person of the name Blackthorne to Sir Cedric's niece. He closed the folder. The amendment is a forgery. The claim is a fabrication. and the packet was removed from Sir Cedric's study, not to deprive Miss Blackthorne of her inheritance, but to prevent the formal legal examination that executing the revised will would have required, an examination under which the forged record could not have survived. The room erupted, or something close to it. A collision of voices, of chairs moved suddenly, Lestrade coming to his feet with an expression that combined outrage and the rapid recalibration of a man who prides himself on not being caught entirely flat-footed. Davenant said something forceful that I did not catch. Mrs. Finch made no sound at all, but went a remarkable colour. Peters, apparently on instinct, stepped back through the door he had been guarding. Holmes stood in the centre of it unmoved, as a post stands in a current, waiting. When the room quieted to something manageable, he spoke again. "Mr. Vale," he said, entered the study on the evening of the 9th at Sir Cedric's own request, to discuss an unrelated estate matter left when the discussion was concluded. The confrontation witnessed by the kitchen maid, the raised voice, the frightened quality of it, the woman's reply, occurred after Vale's departure. The words "you have no rightful claim here" were addressed not to Vale, but to the woman who had come to Sir Cedric's study at his written invitation, to answer for what he had begun to suspect. He turned, finally, fully, toward Evelyn. Psst. Sir Cedric had found the discrepancy in the legal archive himself. He was elderly and unwell, but he was not a man of diminished intelligence. Wrote to you. You came, and he told you what he knew. Evelyn Blackthorne looked at him. Then she looked at her hands. Then she looked at nothing in particular, which is the direction a person looks when they are no longer performing for an audience, but have not yet decided what comes next. She said nothing. Holmes looked at Lestrade. The planted evidence in Vale's quarters, fragment of legal correspondence behind the wainscoting, was placed during the period yesterday morning when the constable you assigned was at the door rather than inside the room. You will wish to note that in your report. Lestrade, to his considerable credit, took out his notebook and wrote it down. Holmes let the room sit in its reconfigured understanding for a moment, the patience of a man who knows that truths of a certain magnitude require a few moments of habitation before they can be fully occupied. Then he said quietly, "What if Mr. Vale never sought to steal an inheritance? What if he sought, however imperfectly, and without full understanding of what he had found, to expose one?" Vale raised his head. Psst. It was the first time since the gathering began that his expression had changed from the braced stillness of anticipated verdict. What replaced it was not triumph. It was something considerably quieter, and in its quietness considerably more affecting. Fire in the grate settled with a soft collapse of ash, and the room held its breath around the answer it had just been given. Chapter 9. True Clement. The silence that follows the collapse of a sustained deception has a quality distinct from ordinary silence. It is not empty. It is dense with the sound of people revising themselves, reconsidering every conversation, every gesture, every moment of sympathy or indignation, discovering in each a new and disquieting meaning. The drawing-room at Ravenshollow held that silence for what felt like a considerable time after Holmes's final question had settled over it. Lestrade broke it first, practical manner of a man whose profession requires that feeling be subordinated to procedure. He rose from his chair, crossed to where Evelyn Blackthorne sat, with her hands still in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance she had apparently retreated to, and addressed her in the formal language of his office. She received it without visible reaction. She did not protest, did not weep, did not produce any of the responses that dramatic convention might have suggested. She simply rose when asked. Quality of her movement was the same composed efficiency it had always been, which I found, in the new light of everything, more unsettling than agitation would have been. Reverend Pike surprised me. He had not moved from his chair during the exchange, and I had been watching him with the particular attention one gives to a man who has just been comprehensively dismantled in public, and whose next action is therefore genuinely unpredictable. He did not adopt the defiance of a cornered man, nor the theatrical repentance of one who has calculated that remorse is his best remaining instrument. He simply unclasped his hands from his knee, looked at Holmes with an expression that contained, beneath its ruin, something that might almost have been relief, and said, in a voice that was quiet and entirely steady, "I should like to make a full statement." Holmes turned toward him, with the attentiveness of a man who has expected this and finds it, if anything, a point in the subject's favour. "That would be the appropriate course," he said. Lestrade arranged himself with his notebook, and Pike spoke. He had known the Blackthorn firmly since his appointment to the living, he said nearly 30 years ago. He had known Sir Cedric well, respected him, and had understood perhaps better than most the particular loneliness of a man of property and consequence who found himself, in his final decade, without a natural heir and without the temperament to attach easily to the distant relations the law would otherwise reward. Props. When the woman who called herself Evelyn Blackthorn had first made contact with him, some 4 years previously, she had presented herself not as a claimant, but as a researcher, a woman of intelligence and considerable knowledge of the family history, who had encountered, in European archives, references to the Blackthorn line that suggested an imperfectly documented branch. She was persuasive, Pike said. He did not say it as an excuse. He said it as an accurate statement of a material fact. And the idea she presented was not, in its initial form, entirely dishonest. There were gaps in the historical record. The family had members who had gone abroad and been imperfectly documented at home. It required only a small step from genuine ambiguity to deliberate clarification. And she made that step seem, at the time, more like scholarship than forgery. He paused. "I made it seem so to myself," he said. "Which is a different thing, and worse. The amendment to the baptismal register had been accomplished over 3 separate visits," he explained, "spread across 18 months. He had the access, the knowledge, and the technical means. The woman who became Evelyn Blackthorn had provided the specific details of the fictional Eleanor's life. Dates, marriages, the line of descent, and Pike had rendered them into ink that would pass, to any but the most forensically attentive eye, as original. When Sir Cedric received the woman and took to her immediately," Pike continued, "post, I told myself that the warmth between them was itself a kind of legitimacy, that the happiness of an old man in his final years was not nothing, and that the harm was largely theoretical." He looked at his hands. "I was, of course, wrong. Sir Cedric was a decent man who had been deceived into a warmth that was not freely given in return, but strategically cultivated. That is not a kindness. It is its opposite." Holmes had listened to all of this from his position near the writing table without interruption. When Pike finished, Holmes asked only one question. "The woman's actual identity," he said. "What do you know of it?" Pike shook his head. "Only what she told me, which I now know to have been selective. Her name," she said, "was Clara Voss. She had been born in Brussels to an English mother. She had some connection to the family history. through her mother's side. How genuine that connection was, I cannot now determine. I chose at the time not to examine it too closely. Holmes looked across at Lestrade. Brussels connection will bear investigating. I have made a preliminary inquiry to an associate there. I expect a reply within the week. He turned back to the room. There are further particulars to establish, but the essential structure is now plain. Miss Voss assumed the identity of Evelyn Blackthorne based upon a genealogical fiction constructed with Reverend Pike's assistance. Sir Cedric encountered the discrepancy between the family archive he held privately and the record as amended, wrote to Miss Voss requesting an explanation, and was told, face to face in his own study, on the evening of the 9th, truth of what he had befriended. The shock, I said, for a man in poor health. Physician's report records that Sir Cedric's decline in his final days was more rapid than the preceding pattern suggested, Holmes said. The attending doctor attributed it to the natural variability of his condition. I have no reason to dispute the medical findings. The conversation in that study, and whatever passed between them in its aftermath, is unlikely to have improved what remained of his constitution. Room absorbed this. Davenant, who had not spoken since the gathering began, made a sound that was not quite a word and turned toward the window, putting his broad back to the assembled company, in the manner of a man who needs a moment he cannot ask for. Holmes moved now to the aspect of the matter that several faces in the room had been quietly anticipating. The inheritance itself, he said, the original will, which remains in legal force, distributes the estate between charitable institutions and a distant relation. However, the genealogical research that Miss Voss employed as the vehicle for her fraud has, as a secondary consequence, surfaced authentic historical material concerning the Blackthorne line. He reached into the leather folder a second time and produced a document I not seen the previous evening. It was a letter from the London solicitor's firm, dense with the formal language of legal correspondence. In the course of examining the Brussels records, my associate identified a legitimate surviving member of the Blackthorne family, not through the fictional Eleanor, but through a separate and entirely genuine line, a younger brother of the generation of 1850, who emigrated to Belgium, and whose descendants remained on the continent, without maintaining contact with the English branch. The current representative of that line is a gentleman of 52 named Charles Aldrich Blackthorne, a schoolmaster in Liège, who has been entirely unaware of his English connection, and who stands under proper examination as the legitimate heir to Ravenshollow. The room took this in with varying degrees of capacity. Pembroke was already writing. Mrs. Finch, I noticed, had adjusted her expression to something that was not quite her habitual severity, and was not quite anything else. The expression of a woman who has served a house for many years, and is quietly computing what it means for the house to continue under new and legitimate authority. Vale, who had been silent throughout the entire proceeding, exhaled a long breath that he appeared to have been holding since Holmes first addressed the room. The sound of it was undemonstrative, almost inaudible, but I heard it, and I thought it contained more than relief. It contained the particular quality of a man who has been publicly accused of a specific character, and publicly returned to his own. Holmes looked at him. "You encountered the discrepancy in the estate papers before Sir Cedric did," he said. "You saw something in the genealogical documents that troubled you without your being able immediately to identify what it was why you wished to leave. You were not certain what you had found, and you were not certain what would happen to you if you stayed while whatever it was resolved itself. Vale met his gaze. I found a reference in the estate correspondence to the legal archive from the 1870s. I sent to London for a copy. It arrived 2 days before Sir Cedric died. He paused. I had not yet decided what to do with it when everything became rather more urgent than the question of what to do. You said you were not the man they took you for, Holmes said. I meant that I was not a man who would steal from someone who trusted him. Vale said quietly, whatever else I am not that. Holmes regarded him for a moment with an expression that was not warm, precisely, because warmth was not an instrument Holmes deployed with any regularity, but which was as close to it as his temperament permitted. No, Holmes said, you are not. Lestrade completed his immediate arrangements with the brisk efficiency of a man reorganizing his professional dignity around a new set of facts. As he led Miss Voss, for so she must now be called, from the room, she paused at the door and looked back, not at Holmes, not at Pike, but at the room itself. At the portraits on the facing wall, at the tall windows, the particular quality of morning light that came in off the Sussex coast, and fell across the furniture of a house she had spent 4 years learning to inhabit. It was the only unguarded moment I had seen from her in the entire investigation, and it lasted no longer than a second before her composure returned, and she passed through the door. Holmes watched the space she had left, with the expression he sometimes wore after a complex problem had fully resolved. It was not satisfaction, not only. It was the expression of a man considering, with his characteristic honesty, what a thing had cost. World sees guilt most readily where it already expects to find it. He had said so. In the private conversation of the previous evening, standing now in the drawing-room of Ravenshollow Manor, with the case concluded around him, I believed it was not merely an observation about this investigation, but a principle he had carried across many years and many cases, found repeatedly confirmed. Outside, the Sussex coast went on with its indifferent business. The sea moved, downs held their colour against the autumn sky, and Ravenshollow waited, as old houses, for whoever would come next to claim the right to call it home. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. We left Ravenshollow Manor on the morning following the gathering, in the same trap that had met us at the station and driven us up the Elm Avenue, through rain what seemed by then a considerable time ago. The avenue looked different in the pale October sunshine. The elms had shed more of their leaves in the intervening days, and the light came through the remaining ones at an angle that turned them briefly, gold before the wind took them. Holmes sat beside me with his hat set low and his coat buttoned against the morning air, said very little, until the manor had disappeared behind the curve of the road, and the village church spire had taken its place on the horizon. Pike will cooperate fully, he said, as though resuming a conversation we had not in fact begun. The statement he gave Lestrade yesterday afternoon was more complete than I had anticipated. He named dates, described methods, and identified 3 separate occasions on which Miss Voss, I shall continue to call her so, for want of anything more certain, visited the vestry. Under the pretext of genealogical research, it will be sufficient. And Miss Voss herself, I said. She has said nothing, which is the response of an intelligent person who understands that everything she might say would be evaluated against what is already known. He looked out at the passing countryside. People who have constructed an identity over years tend, when that identity is removed, to discover that speaking is the only form of existence that remains available to them. I imagine she will have a considerable amount to say in time. To whomever will listen with the appropriate authority, we reached the station. With 20 minutes to spare, Holmes bought a newspaper, read the front page with apparent indifference, folded it under his arm. On the platform, waiting for the London train, amid the ordinary commerce of travellers and luggage, the whole Ravenshollow affair had the quality that concluded cases sometimes acquire in their immediate aftermath. The quality of something whose dimensions can only now be properly perceived, now that one is no longer inside it. I thought about Arthur Vale. He had come to see us the previous evening, briefly and without ceremony, knocking at the door of the room. Holmes and I shared an entering with the air of a man who has something to say, and has resolved to say it before the opportunity closes. He was already, he told us, in communication with a firm of accountants recommended by Pembroke, who had agreed to assist with the management of his debts. He intended to remain in the district, at least for the present. He had spoken with Pembroke about the possibility of some continued role in the administration of the estate during the period before Charles. Blackthorne could be properly contacted and the legal transfer of ownership arranged. Pembroke had not discouraged him. He thanked Holmes with the directness of a man who is not naturally given to formal expressions of gratitude, and finds the obligation, therefore, doubly uncomfortable to discharge. Holmes received it with a nod that managed to be both acknowledgment and dismissals, without carrying any quality, rudeness in either direction. When Vale had gone, Holmes stood at the window for a moment, and said nothing which was its own kind of comment. Struck me. Considering Vale on the station platform was not the drama of his exoneration, but the particular ordinariness of what it returned him to. He had been a man in debt, in a difficult position, working for an employer he respected in a house whose atmosphere had become, without his fully understanding why, oppressive. He had found something in a document that troubled him, and had not yet decided how to act upon it. He had been, in the language Holmes had used, ready-made, a figure whose existing vulnerabilities had been carefully read and exploited by a person who understood how to construct a story from materials already to hand. That understanding had been, I reflected, a technically impressive element of Miss Voss's operation. She had not invented Vale's guilt, had found the raw materials for it lying in plain sight, and arranged them in the sequence most likely to produce, in the minds of people disposed to see guilt in a particular quarter, precisely the picture she required. The debts were real. The key was real. Proximity was real. The resignation letter was real, if misdated in meaning. She had added only the burned parchment, the planted correspondence, window she had used for her own exit, and the stopped clock, whose temporary blindness she had not arranged but had, with the quick intelligence of a person accustomed to using what the moment offers, exploited the instant she understood what Briggs's slow watch had created. The train arrived. We found a compartment. Holmes opened his newspaper without reading it, which was characteristic, and I looked out at the platform as it receded and gave way to the familiar English landscape, moving northward toward London. "There is something I have been turning over," I said. When the station had fully disappeared behind us, Holmes looked up. "She knew the house," I said. "Evelyn, Miss Voss. She knew it well enough to understand the window latch, to know when Briggs cleaned the clock, to know when the corridor was unobserved. That knowledge takes time and repeated presence. She had been at Ravenshollow more than once before she presented herself as Sir Cedric's niece. 3 times, Holmes said by Pike's account, under various pretexts. Twice as a researcher visiting the local area, once as a representative of a charitable organisation to which Sir Cedric had contributed. She used each visit to map the house systematically. By the time she introduced herself as Evelyn Blackthorne, she knew Ravenshollow rather better than several of the people who lived in it. It argues considerable premeditation. It argues a woman of uncommon intelligence and discipline who had made a study of a specific kind of vulnerability, Holmes said. Vulnerability of an old man without close family, in a large house, with property that must pass somewhere when he is gone. There is, I suspect, history preceding Ravenshollow, that the Brussels inquiry will eventually illuminate. This is unlikely to have been the first occasion on which she identified such a situation and moved toward it. The thought was not comfortable, and I did not pretend it was. And Lestrade? I said, after a moment. Holmes permitted himself the expression I had seen him wear on numerous previous occasions when Lestrade's name arose in the context of a case's conclusion. An expression that contained in careful proportion genuine respect for the man's professional application and an equally genuine assessment of its limitations. Lestrade will write a thorough report, attribute appropriate credit in the appropriate directions, and emerge from the experience with his fundamental convictions entirely intact, which is perhaps as it should be. The world requires people who look where they are told to look, Watson. It requires rather fewer people who look where nobody has thought to point. I considered this. You knew, I said, before you went to London, before the handwriting comparison. You knew the claim was fraudulent. Holmes was quiet for a moment, the manner of a man choosing between several accurate answers and selecting the most precise. I suspected it, he said, from the moment Pembroke told me that Vale's phrase was not. I did not do it, but I am not the man they take me for. A guilty man protests the act. An innocent man in Vale's particular position protests the construction of himself as a certain kind of person. The distinction was small, but it did not leave me. He turned the unread newspaper over in his hands. Preet. Everything after that was the work of establishing what I suspected on a foundation, sufficient for a court. Suspicion, however well-founded, not justice. It is only the beginning of the obligation to find it. The train moved on through the morning. The countryside opened around us, particular English variety of it. Fields and hedgerows, and the distant suggestion of industry on the horizon. And I settled into the rhythm of the journey, and thought about what the case had been. At its core, beneath the forged records, and the stopped clock, and the planted evidence, it had been a case about the willingness of people to see what they had already decided to see. Sir Cedric had decided to see a niece, and had seen one. Davenant had decided to see a dishonest secretary, and had seen one. Lestrade had decided to see a solved case, and had seen one. The household, collectively, had decided that the evidence before them confirmed the story they had been given, and had not asked whether the story and the evidence might both have been provided by the same hand. Holmes had not been immune to the mechanism. He had said as much. In those first hours at Baker Street, when he had asked me whether Ville's phrase struck me as peculiar, he had been checking his own assumptions then as deliberately as he checked everything else. That was the difference, I thought. Not that Holmes did not form assumptions. He formed them constantly, rapidly, fluency that was itself a kind of gift. But that he treated each one as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion, kept the distinction between them rigorous, even when the evidence pressed hard against it. We reached Victoria in the early afternoon, closed around us. With its familiar noise and complexity, the cab ranks and the newspaper sellers, and the particular quality of the city air that is not quite like air anywhere else. Holmes hailed a hansom with his customary efficiency and gave the Baker Street address. In the cab, we moved through the traffic. He lit his pipe and looked out at the passing streets. I watched the city return to us, paused, and I thought that I would write the case up in due course. When I had achieved sufficient distance from it to render its proportions accurately, it deserved, I thought, a careful treatment. Not for the drama of its resolution, which had been quieter than many of our investigations, for what it demonstrated about the conditions under which honest minds may be led by perfectly natural processes. Very far from the truth, Holmes blew a thoughtful ring of smoke toward the cab window, watched it dissolve, and said nothing further until Baker Street. But, as we climbed the familiar stairs, and Mrs. Hudson's voice rose from below asking about luncheon, he paused on the landing and turned to me with the ruminative expression of a man voicing a thought that has been forming since Sussex. Once men decide who is guilty, he said, they no longer examine facts, only confirmations. He went in. I heard him set his pipe on the mantelpiece, heard the familiar creak of his chair, and stood for a moment on the landing before following, listening to the sounds of Baker Street, reassembling themselves around us like a language one has been briefly away from, and finds, on return, entirely unchanged. Outside, the London fog was coming in off the river, softening the gas lamps one by one into blurred and amber shapes, laying its quiet hand over the city as it had done on 10,000 evenings before, and would do on 10,000 more. Within it, somewhere, other problems were gathering themselves into the particular configurations that, in time, find their way up our stairs. Holmes would receive them as he always did, with impatience, with appetite, the ruthless courtesy he extended to any question sufficiently interesting to repay examination. I went in and closed the door. Fog settled over Baker Street, and the evening began.